It might sound somewhat tautological, but contemporary art is having a boom. There's hardly any city that doesn't flaunt its contemporary art museum. At more and more places the world over, biennials are regularly devoted to taking stock of the current situation, and by doing so are able to attract large international audiences. Professorships and research programs are being set up to explain it all. But what does the term contemporary art mean, and above all, what historical time, what present does it refer to? The first thing to note is that the term contemporary art has largely superseded the term modern art for describing the art of our time. To be absolutely modern today, it seems, is no longer quite up to date. But how can we understand this displacement of modern art by contemporary art, the art of the present? One first intuition might be to understand it as a distancing from modern art's own programmatic movements of displacement. In the end, modern art was a decidedly anti-traditional art committed to progress. In contrast, the term contemporary art seems to claim to be neutral. Contemporary art, one might think, merely describes the art that exists right now. Such a definition, however, according to which the term would be neutrally applied to the art that has just emerged, obviously falls far short. For then, all art would once have been contemporary art, and everything produced yesterday would no longer be contemporary art. Aside from the fact that art history is not written as a sequence of unrelated points in time, as is well known, such a view also leads to confusion with regard to how we understand the present at all. Jacques Derrida pointed out that one would do well not to try to come to any understanding of the present by analytically compressing it into a single point in time. In fact, as Paul Valéry explained in a passage cited by Derrida, you quickly land in the realm of fixed ideas if you attempt to stick the point of the present into the actual moment. For by trying to do so, you will only get further away from its immediate present. Following Valéry, Derrida saw the fact that the present cannot be made present in such a way as an indication that it is always more and other than itself, as it were, that it contains a certain potentiality. Valéry very suggestively gives this potentiality, which is always implicit in the present, the name inflex. If one uses this term politically, as Dietmar Dart and Barbara Kirchner have recently sought to do over around 900 pages, big book in German, the inflex designates a dimension within the complex of the present, which is not subsumed in the seeming evidence of the immediately given. It designates what inextricably joins up with reality with possibility. To be more precise, the inflex reminds us of what opens up to the present, to the question of the future, as well as to that of the past. For under the sign of the inflex, the past also does not appear as something merely given, but can be read anew with regard to the question of its meaning for today and tomorrow. And there's some link here with the discussion on the document. Now, it might occur to one that it is no accident that the thinking of the inflex, the reminder of a certain potentiality in what is, can be traced back to a modernist, even perhaps emblematically modernist writer, Paul Valéry. For there is yet another, quite different interpretation of the neutral appearance that the term contemporary art initially suggests, an interpretation that is not grounded on its neutrality, but on the contrary, that criticizes this appearance as ideology. According to these diagnoses, the term contemporary art, at least in the West, has established itself over modern art in that every perspective on historical change has been displaced, and thus the implicit dynamism or the potential of the currently given has also been supplanted, and indeed in favor of a pseudo-dynamic, which is nothing other than the continuation and confirmation of the same. According to this diagnosis, The continual production of the new that we see in contemporary art raises no claim to be different in relation to tradition, unlike the case with the avant-gardes of modernism. The new would then only be original, but no longer originary. It would only distinguish itself individualistically, but no longer produce a new beginning, that is, one that reaches out beyond the originality of the individual. The contemporaneity of contemporary art, according to this rather gloomy diagnosis, is nothing but the nightmare of an eternal now, a shallow present without historical depth, which of course fits in perfectly well with the widespread economization of the life world, with its consequence that there is only still something new to consume, but not to live. The empiricist fixation on the now in art is then the exact correlate of a time caught in immanence. This description of the current state of things corresponds to the diffuse feeling that the present is no longer defined by the directional vector of historical development, instead gently spreading out in a peculiar way so it becomes broader, as Hans-Ulrich Gumbrecht has put it. For Gumbrecht, the broad present marks nothing less than the end of the chronotope of historical time itself. Gumbrecht sees one indication of his diagnosis in the fact that the great generational conflicts seem to be missing today. We no longer see young people with intellectual Oedipal murder fantasies, Gumbrecht asserts in astonishment. They simply no longer quite fit into Karl Bloom's notion of an intellectual history spurred on by the anxiety of influence. Instead of aggressively rejecting previously generations, it would seem that young artists today practically embrace their influence. Radical breaks and new beginnings have been replaced by referential acknowledgements. Contemporary art spans nets of references into the past, thus only expanding, if one believes the critique, its peculiar timeless present even further backward. According to this diagnosis, contemporary art absorbs all previous isms, all historical movements, to the degree that it itself can no longer be identified in terms of any historical development, that it itself is thus no longer any ism, not even modernism. According to this culturally pessimistic reading, what was discussed in the 90s with the keyword posthistoire has in fact therefore been realized with regard to contemporary art. Everything appears in this reading as if art had entered into a period after the end of history. In place of making us realize our historical time through style, art then would eclectically level out historical differences. In place of visible breaks, it would only offer false totalities, and in place of decided engagement, it would only show indifference and boredom. Now, there's no denying that all of this exists in contemporary art world. Anti-eclecticism, historical amnesia, indifference, boredom. The question, however, is whether these phenomena should be taken for the whole. I find such a conclusion hasty, even wrong. The first indication that we should not be so quick to give the last word about our present to the posthistoire diagnosis, even in view of Western societies alone, can be seen already if we consider some recent social research that puts the critical complaint that the youth of today no longer rebel as they ought to in a very different perspective. For in view of the current state within these societies, the French sociologist Alain Ehrenberg, for example, has stated that the paradigmatic mythological figure of the present is no longer Oedipus, who has fallen into conflict with the law of the father, but rather Narcissus, the person taken sick from a too ideal image of himself. As is well known, narcissism is not a kind of self-love, but the state of being trapped in an ideal image of one's own self to the point that it is paralyzing, if not even fatal. Now, this shift is to be seen in the context of broader social developments addressed also, for example, by Luc Boltanski and Yves Chapelleau in their study on the new spirit of capitalism. For as the authors demonstrate, in significant parts of Western societies, self-responsibility, initiative, flexibility, creativity have become decisive requirements that subjects have to fulfill in order to take part in social life. They have replaced the older model of disciplinary societies without, of course, doing away with discipline. In place of standardizing the subject according to socially established role models, there is now the compulsion to creative self-realization under the sign of competition. Subjects then no longer obey by complying with the regime or following rules, but by creatively performing a task on their own initiative. As Yves Chapelleau has pointed out, the artist's form of life that once promised a specific freedom has linked up with the current form of capitalism in a way that produced new forms of alienation. The rebellious artist who cares nothing for narrow-minded rules and instead does his or her thing becomes the model for the masses, his exceptional creativity thereby, of course, being toned down to a moderate inventiveness and his heroic melancholy diffusing into the depression of the masses. Indeed, as one can learn from Ehrenberg, the steadily increasing symptoms of depression in the capitalist societies of the West have to be read as narcissist personality disturbances that point at least in part to the difficulties in which individuals end up attempting to comply with an abstract and subjectivist idea of freedom in a concrete reality with real limitations. Given such situation, however, the call for young rebels in art might seem nostalgic at best. Young people today have thus not left history. Rather, they have entered into another historical constellation, into a constellation in which it is no longer primarily about emancipating oneself from the father figure and his rules, but about positioning oneself in a critical relationship to an ideology that no longer acknowledges social inequalities but only individual failure. A response to this state of affairs obviously cannot be found in a renewed claim to individual freedom, but in politicizing this freedom by drawing attention to its social conditions. For social conflicts are occluded to the degree to which individual freedom is posited as being without presupposition, social presuppositions. Now, of course, whoever realizes that the subjectivist idea of freedom is itself something that has to be addressed in its political dimensions will also recognize that even the complex of a present dominated by neoliberalism actually contains an implex, a potentiality that could open it up to change. This is attested to not least by recent political movements. Nevertheless, pointing out the current social constellation is not enough to invalidate an objection to contemporary art that can be formulated precisely in view of this constellation. Namely, that the productions of contemporary art here are more part of a problem than part of the solution. Art, one might think, cannot counter the new spirit of capitalism, which no longer suppresses the creativity, spontaneity, and originality of its subjects, but rather demands and exploits it. Today, in fact, hardly anything makes a more dismal impression than an art that narcissistically relies on the idea of individual creativity, as if the world were still set up with the side of art being bright and colorful, while that of the manager remains dull and flannel grey. The world of management itself has become occupied by creative subjects in the meantime, so that the difference of art from everything else can no longer be convincingly defined by creativity alone. And this situation is made even more acute, one might go on to think, by the fact that art, with its own art-specific critique of the myth of the genius artist, has itself offered up a decisive contribution to the homogenization of the creative industries and artistic practice. This is something that Andreas Reckwitz, for example, thinks. But this last conclusion is misleading, I think. For the new spirit of capitalism sustains exactly the subjectivist myth of the genius, creating from the inexplicable interior of his or her individuality only no longer reducing its transgressive power of innovation to the exception of the artist, but by encouraging it in the most ordinary project employee. The critique of the myth of the artist that has been formulated by artists themselves, a lot of them being women artists, it's respect, by the way. The critique of the myth of the genius that has been formulated by artists themselves, on the other hand, is directed precisely against the subjectivism of this myth that is being mobilized by neoliberal ideology. Against mythologizing ideas of artistic creation and inspiration, artistic critique since the 60s has increasingly focused on the circumstance that even the most individualist artistic activity is always already subjected to the influence of society. We are familiar today with various artistic approaches that negate or undermine such a subjectivist idea of art production. One might think of appropriation art that made explicit that the claim to artistic originality is more often than not bound up to a certain repression of influences. But one could also think of the many artistic procedures that rule out the trace of the artist's subjectivity as such, be it through chance operations or through the inclusion of industrial forms of production that underscore that art is not the authentic other of the general conditions of production that structure the rest of our life world, but in fact partakes in them. Artists today largely see themselves as people who cannot evade social influences any more than anyone else can. Of course, this has not abolished the social significance of the artist, but rather shifted its meaning. The artist is no longer significant for the society due to his exceptional status of being singled out from it, but rather as a witness to his cultural and social present as a contemporary. Now, this obviously contradicts the suspicion that artists have contributed to the normalization and economization of creativity through their critique of the myth of the art of the genius. For the artistic critique of this myth aimed at its subjectivism, a subjectivism that the neoliberal normalization of this myth has not at all abolished, but in fact confirmed. But this shift in the artist's self-understanding also provides us with an indication that the posthistoire diagnosis might not speak the whole truth about contemporary art as well. For it demonstrates that significant developments in more recent art can be traced back to critical motifs. The turn against the metaphysical notion of the artist's genius, still very much alive in modernism, if one thinks of emblematic figures like Picasso or Pollock, is motivated, it is a critical turn. This suggests a very different reading of contemporary art than the one offered by the cultural pessimists. What if the displacement of modernism by contemporary art were to be understood not as some departure from history as such, but as a critical, motivated turn against certain aspects of modernism? If one follows this intuition, the term contemporary art, of course, immediately loses its programmatic neutrality, instead becoming legible normatively, namely as a figure of progress in critical consciousness. However, such a notion of contemporary art could not be satisfied with empirically registering the presumably given. It would, in fact, have to be decidedly anti-empiricist. For to qualify something as contemporary art would then mean to normatively mark it out, not least with respect to the question of whether it contributes to the understanding of its own time. The full normative sense of the term contemporary art consists in the fact that it is meant to make our historical present to us. The task of making the present present, however, requires taking an attitude toward one's own time that neither blindly merges into it nor assiduously conforms to its demands. So what exactly does it mean to be a contemporary, a comrade of one's time, a Zeitgenosse? Rose Kreuz has proposed the nice idea that the contemporary, like any good comrade or companion, should help out his own time, should rush in to help it when things get difficult, for example, when it is perceived as unproductive, as mired in sticky immanence, as indifferent and meaningless. Contemporaneity would consequently be much more than a matter of merely participating in chronological time. To the contrary, to be true to one's own time, to be a good contemporary, would mean adding certain discontinuities into the continuum of chronological time. This begins, as Giorgio Agamben has asserted in a small text on the notion of the contemporary, already in the moment in which someone speaks of his time or our time, thus identifying himself as a contemporary. Being with the time, being contemporary, means to split time, to add caesuras which make it legible in the first place. This is not only the case with regard to the division between chronological time and the eccentric time of experience, already operative when the contemporary declares the present to be his time, but also, as Agamben emphasizes further, with respect to the task of trying to define the historical meaning of the present. Well, this also means placing the present in a relationship to the past, indeed in a way that the present gets some direction from this relationship, a direction of historical development leading into a future. But what are the caesuras that can be set in order to understand the contemporaneity of contemporary art as a critical answer to modernism, which it seems to distance itself from so programmatically? In his contribution to a collection of essays on the question what is contemporary art, that was an anthology this time, of course, Mexican art critic and curator Cuauhtemoc Medina points out the lack of unity in this question. For instance, a reference work with the title Theories and Documents of Contemporary Art takes 1945 as a starting point. Tate Modern, on the other hand, organizes its holdings of contemporary art with artistic productions after 1965. And recently, one increasingly hears 1989 named as the date by which the contemporaneity of contemporary art gets its profile. At first glance, this may seem like a very heterogeneous list, 1945, 1965, 1989, and yet something does connect them. The dates can be connected with various crises in the modern narrative of progress, each of which is in turn linked to the history of art in its own way. If it is correct that the term contemporary art programmatically breaks away from the modern, and indeed in a way that concerns the modernist ideas of progress, then in fact we have here a significant list of dates. Instead of hastily deducing, as the representatives of the posthistoire thesis do, that contemporary art stands for a crisis of progress in general, and thus the term progress does not make sense at all if applied to contemporary art, one should, I'm convinced, evaluate the artistic critique of modernist models of progress in history itself as progress. So what's at stake, what's the subject of criticism here, is not only modernism in certain aspects, but also the modernist understanding of history and progress itself. And I would call this critique of the modernist notions of history and progress progressive. Yeah, quite simple. And this is so for all three of the stages named. So let me quickly go through them. The first date, 1945, marks a threshold after which it is no longer possible to conceive history according to the Hegelian model directly as progress in the consciousness of freedom. So after 1945, this idea that history is a progress in the consciousness of freedom got obviously into crisis, for it stands for the experience of a political moral catastrophe of such proportions that this notion was shaken to its very core. After Auschwitz, in light of this, as Theodor Adorno succinctly put it, and I quote him, a regression that has already taken place, not only every positive doctrine of progress, but also even every assertion that history has a meaning has become problematic and affirmative. and that, of course, directed against the Hegelian notion. This break also had certain effects on aesthetic discourse. Any discussion of the progressive quality of art could now only refer to such works that worked against the false optimism of the idealistic model of progress. This was in part reflected in an artistic critique of conventions of the beautiful, glorified by idealistic aesthetics as an expression of freedom. This is, of course, also reflected in modernist aesthetic theory. One could argue that for the perhaps most influential post-war modernist aesthetic, that of Adorno, it is no longer the category of the beautiful that is decisive, but a post-metaphysical concept of the sublime. After the fall of beauty, Adorno writes in his aesthetic theory, and I quote, "The sublime was the only aesthetic idea left to modernism," end quote. For he goes on to argue, quote, the ascendancy of the sublime is one with art's compulsion that fundamental contradictions not be covered up but fought through in themselves. Thus, however, the sublime becomes latent. End of quote. In other words, the sublime takes on the structural meaning of formal principles that negate the beautiful form with its proportion, its balance, its unbroken unity, its harmony. Turning against beauty's self-righteous triumph over its other, the sublime unfolds its latent work as the principle of formlessness at the core of the then no longer affirmatively beautiful form. My point here, however, is that even the story of modernism can already be told as a story of a correction in the notion of progress, namely of its idealistic understanding. And by the way, Peter, it's already in the aesthetic theory, is a theory, I would say, of the anti-aesthetic in a certain sense, which complicates my notion of aesthetic. The second threshold, dated somewhat at random by the Tate at 1965, stands for a developmental point in art that can no longer so easily be seen as compatible with the categories of post-war modernist aesthetics. For during the 60s, art insistently turned against the system of the individual arts as well as against the unity of the work, that is, against the presuppositions that still defined the aesthetics of the 50s, even when they stood under the sign of the sublime. So this is where Adorno and Rieberg are actually on one point, that they both insisted that art can only be art within the setting of the old system of the art. While the development toward open and intermediate works had begun somewhat earlier, the tendency increased to such an extent during the 60s that it became irrefutable and was a problem for modernist art theory. For one now began to encounter works more and more frequently that could neither be allocated solely to the tradition of one art alone, nor did they restrict themselves in any way to traditional artistic media, instead engaging with new technologies and industrial production methods. Furthermore, it was often no longer possible to tell where the lines separating the works from their non-artistic outside were to be drawn. Rather, the works deliberately destabilized them. These developments through post-war modernist art theory, from Greenberg to Adorno, which, for all its critique of idealistic aesthetics, still hung onto the idea of the work's unity and onto the necessity of dividing art into various arts, into crisis. And with it, the modernist notion of artistic progress. For with regard to hybrid and open works, it seemed impossible at first glance to identify any developmental logic at all. Open and hybrid works not only seemed to evade any comparison with the art of the past because they, as intermediate, could no longer be read and judged against the background of a tradition, of music, of painting, of sculpture, of literature, etc., they were, due to their unclear borders to the non-aesthetic life world, no longer even given as something definite. This shift is certainly the decisive one in the confrontation between contemporary art and modern art, because it is here that the art theory of post-war modernity, associated with the term high modernism, expressly reaches its limits, particularly as regards its understanding of progress in history. With regard to the visual arts, the great divide between high modernism and what came after is represented by minimalism. Modernist art critic Michael Fried not only criticized minimalist objects for ambivalently lying between sculpture and painting, but also for opening up the exhibition situation without ever making that relation explicit. Minimalist objects, Fried observed, seem to be what they are only by virtue of the beholder who perceives them in different ways depending on perspective. Indeed, if you think of Fred Sandberg's minimalist Lyon installations, for example, it is equally possible to look at them as a picture-like constellation of tender lines against a neutral backdrop, as it is to experience them in a more tactile manner, as it were, as interventions into the architecture of the exhibition space. In both tendencies, the dissolution of the boundaries between the arts and between art and non-art have been radicalized in the wake of minimalism and today often take on much more drastic forms. Santiago Sierra's political twists on the aesthetics of minimalism are a good case in point. Think, for example, of the work he did in Brisbane in 2010, where he employed workers to hold heavy-looking minimalist structures to the wall by resting them on their shoulders. But to focus solely on the working conditions of those that literally keep the art up for us, for example, is partly to ignore the artistic work, and it is obviously no more instructive merely to insist that what one is looking at is just an arrangement of forms. The very point of this work was precisely the situative discomfort that calls the accepted safety of the audience's position into question, and does so to the very degree to which the boundaries between the aesthetic and the non-aesthetic, between art and non-art, between reality and fiction, become the stake in a doubtlessly serious aesthetic play, not however to provoke the viewer to overcome his status as a spectator and act, but to aesthetically isolate the tension between the formalist and the practical stance, and to set free the reflexive potential of that tension. For this experience confronts the viewer with the problem of his or her own spectatorship, with the different meanings it takes on in different contexts, and with the conventions that support it. This means that the aesthetic here can no longer be short-circuited with formalism. That's also important, of course. Such practices do not negate the aesthetic in favor of the realm of political action, rather they insist on an anti-formalist understanding of the aesthetic. To experience aesthetically now means to experience experience, as Martin Seel once put it, to encounter the worlds of our daily experiences in a new, reflexively distanced manner. This is also to say that even such works do not simply suspend the difference between art and non-art, between artistic representation and empirical reality, rather they call for a fundamentally different understanding thereof. The difference between art and non-art can no longer be made objective as a border between a self-contained work of art and its outside, but manifests itself in the specific reflective structure of the experience that distinguishes our relation to art from all other theoretical and practical ways of living in the world. The aesthetic quality of the object is not tied to certain properties of the object that are defined in advance, but must instead be understood as the product of a process of experience initiated in the engagement with the object. If under the conditions of the dissolution of boundaries, the aesthetic can no longer be understood as the objective other of the non-aesthetic, that does not imply a renunciation of aesthetics thinking, but rather a shift within that thinking. Far from facing the non-aesthetic as its external other, the aesthetic consists now in its reflective transformation. The reflective transformation of the non-aesthetic. But what follows from all this for our understanding of progress and history? Counter to the posthistoire diagnosis, one can now argue that the current situation neither signifies the end of art nor the end of its history, but merely the end of a particular art theory or aesthetics, including its one-dimensional model of progress and historical development. The fact that art since the 60s can no longer be allocated exclusively to the history of only one art, indeed, even the fact that the open works no longer constitute an objectively given, instead expressly referring to their being constituted through contradictory interpretations and readings, has to be understood less as a symptom of a general historical forgetfulness than as a manifestation of a proper understanding of the historicity of art. In fact, even a superficial look at the reception histories of arbitrary works, with their booms, drops in potential, periods of latency, and rediscoveries, shows that their historical life is not absorbed by the role that might be attributed to them by one history of progress. Historically changeable experiences disclose the work anew over and over again in its innovative potential, and in reverse, the absence of such disclosures causes the work to sink into meaninglessness. This, by the way, also indicates that contemporaneity is not some kind of additional quality that artworks might have or might not have, but that it is essential to its very conception. All meaningful art, all art in the emphatic sense, is contemporary. It has meaning for the present. This also has consequences for the discussion of the canon. Instead of assuming a transhistorical validity of great works, we now see that such greatness itself is historically formed, in and through the history of its new and different disclosures in each contemporary context. This also means that the canon is up for discussion at every moment, or at any rate that it can be in principle and must therefore be conceived as dynamic. The many rediscoveries of forgotten artists or artworks by figures of contemporary art, curators but also artists, would then also not be an expression, at least not entirely, of a merely subjective retro taste, which incorporates its material for the purpose of individual distinction. Rather, they express a more complex understanding of art history. And it is certainly also not mistaken to see in this a corrective in the understanding of modernity itself. Although in the context of modernist theory, if one thinks of its emblematic critic Greenberg, for example, modernity sometimes seems as if there were only one temporal direction for it, namely forwards. Modernity is, as Jacques Rancière has pointed out, still factually marked as much by groundbreaking reappropriations of tradition. Any understanding of the modern tradition of the new is insufficient if it ignores the newness of the tradition that goes along with it. From this perspective, contemporary art not only renews the historiographic potential of modernity, it also brings to the fore another dimension of the notion of the contemporary, for its sometimes untimely engagement with the past might bring us back to the present that we have not yet been in. Admittedly, such an idea of contemporaneity once again explicitly contradicts the gloomy image of the posthistoire, which generates its present by, as Gumbrich formulates, always only placing the latest thing from today alongside the latest thing from yesterday without differentiation. This examination of the understanding of modernity, history, and progress also provides the framework for the most recent threshold that is associated with the term contemporary art, 1989. In terms of world politics, the date stands for the end of the Cold War and for so-called globalization, which has provided the rubric for understanding the thorough implementation of a neoliberal, deregulated capitalism that operates globally on the one hand, but which, on the other hand, is characterized by a new attention to questions of post-colonialism. In view of the development in art, the latter certainly involves a further critique of the modernist narrative of progress, and one can read a lot of this also in Peter's book. What now becomes problematic is its increasing restriction to what criticism polemically but tellingly refers to as native art. In fact, recent art is full of critical rereadings and grapplings with Western modernity in the light of the discovery of new genealogies and cultural relations of exchange. This had caused a whole series of not exactly small-scale problems to emerge, which in no way have all been circumvented by contemporary art and the discourse surrounding it. For this is a project that should neither be confused with the fetishization of differences that celebrates the authentic other while keeping its own identity intact, nor with the complaint that condemns Western modernity as the source of all our present troubles, thereby falling back behind all attempts that are working on giving up the overly simple distinctions between West and rest in favor of a more complex historiographies sensible to contradictions. And even the metaphor of being in between, with which theory seems to have created a certain comfort zone for itself, as Andreas Hüssen has recently emphasized, turns out to be somewhat misleading, as it suggests that there are stable national cultures between which such a zone of between could be set up. Complementarily, though, the over-hasty talk of global flow, which presumably penetrates all cultures equally, turns out to be inadequate too, as Hüssen rightly adds. The kind of talk is already askew in view of financial capital, the flows of which in no way run evenly, but asymmetrically. Furthermore, as we know all too well from the experiences of crisis in recent years, they can also falter. But as a cultural metaphor, according to Hüssen, the term global flow assumes that all difference is already obliterated by the new communications technologies which make anything and everything indiscriminately available. One could, however, not immediately make conclusions from these technological conditions about its social and cultural use. Terms such as translation and appropriation would be much more promising in this context, terms that take account of the specificity of each of the contexts involved without losing sight of the fact that neither the starting materials nor the context in each case in which it will be translated or to which it will be appropriated are left unchanged in such processes. Insofar as it is dedicated to examining such circumstances of translation and appropriation, contemporary art is as opposed to the conservative idea of closed cultures as it is to the neoliberal idea of a world culture that is being realized today. Its project is then less that of a translation between the cultures than that of a culture of translation, in which modernity's universalism alone has a future, pointing beyond Western domination. Understood in this way, however, even this last development in art is in the service of an understanding of the present that is precisely not placeless and timeless, but made present in its geographical, cultural, and historical specificity. To conclude, none of the three dates mentioned documents the departure of contemporary art from history, as if artists today wanted to get around the plainly existential question of whether there is progress or not. Rather, the dates in each case stand for a different way of rethinking this question, and this rethinking includes no longer necessarily associating progress with the metaphor of linear advance. Insofar, however, as this rethinking not only occurs in critical engagement with modern models of history and progress, but at the same time links up to modernity's potential to enlightenment, it should also be understood, that's maybe a particularly Frankfurt thing to say, but I'm going to, it should also be understood as a critical self-transgression and self-overcoming of modernity itself. So it's not a break with modernity, but critical self-transformation of modernity. Since it's criticizing models of history and progress that are proved to be limited, proved to be false, proved to be programmatic, but does so not in throwing away with these ideas, but thinking them differently and being true to these ideas. And that's another occasion of truthfulness via critique. We're talking about this. Significantly, this becomes particularly evident precisely in the most recent of the developments mentioned in contemporary art, for it is with regard to the global non-simultaneity and local specificity of the unfolding modernities that the question of what connects them has to be posed. In other words, precisely this opening, the opening of the notion of modernity itself, forces us to confront the task of conceptualizing modernity. And that's also why I think to just put modernity into the plural and talk about modernities doesn't solve anything, but just poses a problem. Because you then still have to say, what's the modern that connects all these modernities? So it's just the beginning of the question and not only the solution. Contemporary art thus obviously does not refer to modernity as if the modern project were completed. Contemporary art is not finished with modernity in a way that everything associated with it could be left behind. The present of contemporary art is much more that of modernity critically transforming itself, and thus of a modernity that is to be conceived as essentially unfinished. Thank you.